The power of the written word. It has changed history, documented life's most poignant moments, and helped us find our best selves. This week on Full Frame, conversations with some of today's most acclaimed and best-selling writers. I'm Mike Walter, coming to you from the heart of New York City's vibrant Times Square. Let's take it full frame. Tom Wolfe is an influential American author and essayist. A sports writer in college, he earned a PhD from Yale and worked as a print reporter in Washington, D.C. and in New York. But it was here in New York when he began to abandon journalistic conventions and quickly became one of the most culturally significant thought leaders of his generation. His nonfiction works include The Candy-Colored Tangerine Flake Streamlined Baby and the quintessential guide to 1960s hippie culture, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. Those works were preludes to his highly successful novels, The Right Stuff, The Bonfire of the Vanities, and Back to Blood, among others. Now, nearly 53 years after first appearing in his trademark white suit, Tom Wolfe is joining us to share his life of style and substance and why the power of the written word is changing once again. Welcome to Full Frame.
Thank you very much.
I was watching, I mentioned to you before we started that I watched a bunch of clips online, and my wife got the paddles and actually had to use it on my heart because I saw an interview with you years ago and you were like in a brown suit. I was like, is this Tom Wolfe? When did this come about?
It happened by accident, to tell you the truth. I was working on a newspaper in Washington, the Washington Post, and I came to New York, and I had only two suits, one of which was threadbare, and one was a tweed, a green tweed suit. I always regretted having bought that, and the other was a flannel or something. And the weather, these were hot suits. The weather, it was June, and I knew the hot weather was coming in New York. So I went to a store and I saw a white suit, which was not unusual where I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. My father wore white linen suits all summer. Everybody wore a white linen suit, or men, I mean, or a seersucker. So I got this white suit, and when I got home, I found out that it was hotter than wool. It was a silk tweed. So I started wearing that in November, usually late November when it was cold enough to wear it. And I found out a strange thing. It really annoyed people. Now, why, on the staff as well as everywhere else, and why I enjoyed that, I don't know. I have to call up Dr. Freud on the Nightline, find out what's going on.
Maybe you're just a rebel deep at heart. One of the things I find interesting about you, though, is that this is your uniform now, but you could have been in a baseball uniform. You tried out for the New York Giants. Apparently it didn't go well because you've been writing ever since. Do you ever think about just what might have been if you had that arm like Koufax? Do you think you would have ever written? I mean, would it just have been a baseball career? Or?
I'm afraid it would have been a baseball career, because when you're in school, the high school or college for that matter, the focus is on the athletes. Nobody cares about somebody who's writing this or that. And fortunately, I went to this tryout camp, and for the first 3 days, there was an eternal baseball game. Started at 8 in the morning. It ended at nightfall. Nobody was keeping score. Just the scouts were looking at, see how you did various things. So I had a good long work, about 5 innings on the mound. And then the end of the third day, they cut the field down to a few people they really were interested in. And I didn't make the cut. So I thought it must be a mistake. So I went to this scout who was there, and I said, my name is Wolfe, and I was just pitching out there, and there were only 3 hits in 5 innings, and only 4 people reached second base, but nobody scored. There must be a mistake. He says, son, it's no mistake. He says, but I'll tell you, you've got a pretty good little curve there and a fairly good sinker, but I'll tell you what we're looking for. We're looking for somebody who can tear the catcher's head off with a fastball. He said, as soon as you got one of those, you come on back, we'll give you another shot. So they managed to contain their enthusiasm pretty well.
So you get this pitching arm, and then you end up with a PhD from Yale, and there's so many avenues you can go. I mean, you could have gone the academic route. Clearly, I mean, you've got this great mind, but you decide to become a reporter. Talk to us about that early sojourn into reporting.
Well, I always wanted to, after my baseball career collapsed, I always wanted to be a writer, and I went to graduate school to enable me to get a job teaching, because I figured many writers need something to fall back on. You'd be surprised, maybe you wouldn't be, but how many writers today teach in university. That's to keep body and soul together. So that was my idea. Well, it took me 5 years to finish graduate school, get my PhD. I'd spent 4 years in the undergraduate work. So I was nearly a decade into just nothing but campuses. And so I didn't finish my dissertation until late in the summer. It's too late to get a job teaching. So I decided, well, maybe I can get a job as a newspaper reporter. Sounds interesting. And I sent out so many resumes. You would not believe it. I think I sent out 40. And heard back from only 3. 2 of them were polite no's, and one said one came from the Springfield Union in Springfield, Massachusetts, a place I'd never been in my life. And they said, well, come on up for an interview. So I did, and I got the job. And I remember going back on the train from Springfield and beating the back of the seat in front of me and saying, oh, I am a member of the working press. I am a member of the working press. And this is going to be exciting. Actually, it wasn't very exciting to my father because he had paid for all this graduate school, the rest of it. And it took me 2 days to make the phone call. And I said, Dad, I've got a job. I'm going to be a newspaper reporter. I figured he was going to yell over the phone. And he kind of took it with equanimity, not bad at all. And I was so relieved. And it took me 5 years to realize that he finally gotten me off the family payroll.
I'm convinced there's probably 39 guys out there that wrote the rejection letters to you that would deny it to this day. You know what's interesting, though, too, as a writer, it's that, and I've heard you talk about your writing style. When you're a journalist, you don't have the luxury of sitting there and ruminating. There's a deadline. And so if you have to hack stuff, you have to hack stuff.
You're right.
And I've heard you talk about your writing. You know, I've just got to put the pen to paper, or I've got to bang away at the typewriter. The stuff's got to get done. So there comes a discipline to your writing. Would you agree?
I agree wholeheartedly. I remember William Buckley saying, thank God for the man who invented deadlines. I mean, he didn't always put out a beautiful column or anything else, but he got it done. He got it done. And then I'm very proud of the fact that I never missed a deadline. I may have turned in some rubbish, but I turned in something.
What about, I've heard you talk about writing your first novel, and you weren't like 22 years old at the time, no. And that you just kind of stared at the typewriter and stared at the typewriter. There's nothing more daunting for a writer than that empty white piece of paper, and it's got to come from here and it's got to go there. The pressure's just got to be enormous.
It is, but of course, if you're now, at this stage, I was writing a book. And I did not realize how much you're given as a reporter or a nonfiction writer. You have the cast of characters is ready made for you, the plot is ready made for you, and you only have to make it interesting. Suddenly, you have with a novel, you have all this freedom. You can make them anything you want. You can change their lives. It just doesn't matter. And that was what was so intimidating. There's nothing I can't do with this piece of work, and that was daunting. Also, in writing a novel, you may hit upon a character you meant to be a minor character, but suddenly that character becomes interesting for whatever reason, and you draw him into the plot. And that whole process is kind of unnerving if you've been a reporter like I had been for so many years. You know, my first novel came out, I was 57 years old. Before that, everything was nonfiction. And fortunately, that book did all right. The Bonfire of the
Yeah, I was going to say it did quite well. Father of new journalism. That's the moniker you've earned over time. Now people are talking about the new journalism, blogging, and all these new forms of getting the message out. Social media, of course, big. Your thoughts?
I remember something that Marshall McLuhan said when he was, I guess he was 68 years old, toward the end of his life. And he said, you know, this new medium was fairly new then, television. He said, it's changing the sensory balance of a whole generation of young people in America. And now don't ask me what the sensory balance is, but that's what he said. And as a result, they're becoming tribal. Again, I forget the intervening argument. And tribal people, if handed a piece of paper with writing on it, assume it's a trick. And so they will not even pay attention to it. They'll only listen to the next person who whispers in their ear. And he said, that's tribal living. But in a way, that is really what blogging is. You begin to believe the next person who whispers in your ear. And so many blogs will have, the writer says, and then Harrison did such and such, I forget his first name. I mean, this you don't read in conventional journalism. And so there's something to me not real about it. There's almost no fact-checking. So that's to me the most worrisome thing about the new form of journalism. They're whispering in your ear.
Yeah. Well, how about the great American novel? Has it been written, or do you have it in one of your desk drawers still?
I think it's been written. I think it was Gone with the Wind.
Yeah. Gone
with the Wind is the story of a young woman. She's 16 years old when the novel begins, and she thinks by 17 she'll be too old to get married, and she's desperate over the fact that the boy she wanted is now she's invited to his wedding. You know, I'm walking behind you on your wedding day. So she's very sad. But then as the plot goes on, she's, like everybody else in Atlanta, Georgia, is drawn further and further into the Civil War. And the amazing thing about that book, you never see a battle scene because she's a girl sitting in Atlanta, but you feel like you've been through the entire war. It's a bravura performance. Somehow, Margaret Mitchell, who wrote it, managed to give the atmosphere, the emotions of war. And she never wrote another book.
Before his death, I heard an interview with Ken Kesey where he talked about the book that you wrote about him and his merry pranksters, and he said, Tom Wolfe is a genius. He said, you know, he wasn't here that long with us, but he captured everything without a tape recorder. It all went in his head and it all came out. But he also talked about the radiance of your writing, and that sometimes it can be blinding, that people adore it, and it can have a blinding effect back on you. And that he said that's what harmed Ernest Hemingway along the way. And he goes, it's difficult to get back into your skin as a writer when everyone's looking at you after a while. You're looking at yourself in the mirror. Has that been a problem along the way, keeping that voice, keeping that genuine quality, with so much attention that's been lavished on you over the years?
Well, I wish I had seen that show. Because when he was first asked about it.
Well, you agree with him about the genius part, right?
Well, of course. There's no arguing about that. The first time he was interviewed about it, he said, it was about 3 years after the book came out, he said, well, Wolfe got most of it right. He said, except when he tried to be nice. And he went straight to a passage in which I had intentionally covered up the identity of a couple of people because it would be so embarrassing. But it works two ways. When I was first doing long work, you know, nonfiction work, and I'd call up people like the astronauts, they had no idea in the world who I was. And a lot of them just were not going to set up an interview or anything else. After that book, which well, by then I was beginning to appear on the map a little bit, at least a small village. It became much easier to get to people if you were known. And I felt this through my own experience, that if you're able to stay with someone for a day, if they'll put up with you for a day, and you're talking to them all the time, they will drop most of their defenses if they're willing to stay that long with you. And by the second day, they're beginning to really tell the truth. And all in all, it helped. It helped.
Tom Wolfe, what a delight. Thanks so much for coming in and talking to us.
Oh, this has been great, Michael. Thank you.
Coming up next, the power of the written word as poetry. We'll be right back.